Hello friends, and welcome back into continuation of this course. In this video we will talk about the replication of the Postgresql database. Besides, we will talk about the restoring the data that we have replicated, and then we will talk about streaming the wall archives. These are the subjects that we will talk in this video. But first of all, in this video I will just show you the steps that we will do, what are the codes that we will use, and in the next videos we will do this coding in practice. We will do it on two servers, the master server and the replica server. So this we will do from the next videos. In this video we will just show you what are the steps and what are the codes that we will use. Okay, so let's dive in. Now, first thing to know about the replication is that the user or the role who have the authorization to do a replication of a Postgresql database should have and must have a permission of replication. So the user and the role which will do the replication, when we create that role, when we create that user, we should give him the permission of replication. And we will see that in the next slides, and also we will see it when we do it practically. The second important thing is that this user, this role which we will do the replication, should have also the permission of a login permission as well. Now, in this replication, I will focus only on the physical replication, because there is a logical replication, and the physical replication means that we will replicate the entire cluster of databases to a replica server. So whatever databases inside this cluster, we will replicate it from the master server to the replica server, and this is called the physical replication. Now there are a selective replication. You just replicate one or two databases or some tables. That called is the logical replication. But here in our course we will focus on the physical replication. The other point is about the wall write-ahead log, or the wall archive. The wall archive is just a file to keep track of any committed asynchronous transactions on the master server and replica, using streaming on the replica server. What does that mean? Now, whatever transaction happened on the master server, it will be saved in a file. It will be logged in a file. This file named the write-ahead log, the wall file. Now, we need to stream this file when we replicate the database data from the master server to the replica server. At the same time, we should also stream this write-ahead log file. It's a very important thing, and we have to do it, because later on, if we want to restore the data from the replica server to the master server, if we don't have this write-ahead log file, our database will not work. We cannot make use of it. Now, the second thing is that here we will do asynchronous transactions. What means? Means any transaction that happens in the database, when it is committed, when it persisted in the databases, when it is saved in the databases, that's the meaning of committed. Asynchronous transaction, when this transaction committed, saved, persisted in the database, then we will log it in the wall file, and later on we will transfer it and stream it to the replica file, to the replica server, sorry. The other point is that both the master server and the replica server, both of them should have the same Postgresql version, main version. For instance, if the master server let's say, have Postgresql version, main version 9, and your replica version 9 also. So you replicate all the databases, all the cluster from the master to the replica. Later on, maybe you updated the Postgresql main version on the master server. You made it PostgreSQL 10. Now you need to restore the data from the replica, which is PostgreSQL 9. You will not be able to do that because the master server now has a version 10, PostgreSQL 10. So make sure that at the time of the replication and at the time of the restoration, both server, the master server and the replica server, both should have the same main version, whether it's 9 or 10 or 11 or whatever. Now when we do the replication and when we save all the replicated data on the replica server, we can use that replica server and we can read its data. We can read its data through a select query. This is process called the hot standby. So the replica server, we can also use it and we can read from it the data with the select query, and this process called the hot standby. Also, we can use the replica server. Suppose your master server have crashed. Now, since we have a replica server, we can use that replica server as a main server till we fix the master server. Okay, having said these main points, now the process of the replication from the master server to the replica server consists of the following steps. Create replica cluster in replica server, create a replica slot, then initiate the replication process from a master server into the replica server. These are the steps that we will follow, and I will explain this in these slides, and later on in next videos we will do it in practice in two servers. On one server is the master server and the other server is the replica server. Now one thing to notice, which is a good point to note, is that it is recommended. Now these steps we will do it step by one, from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now there are two steps which is recommended that you do it at the beginning, before step 1 or 2, before you do step 1 or 2 or 3. Now these steps are step number 4 and step number 6. So before you start the replication, you do steps number 4 and 6, and then you start the replication process. Now just keep this in mind because it will help you later on when you do the replication settings of the master server and the replica server. Okay, so let's dive in. The first thing we need to do is to create a cluster on our replica server. Now, as you know, I'm using the master server and I already have installed my PostgreSQL 10 plus, and I have this cluster which is called the main cluster. Now if you don't know how to install the PostgreSQL on a Ubuntu operating system, I have two courses. One course which is installation of PostgreSQL server from a precompiled package, and I have another course which is installation of PostgreSQL fully encrypted using data at rest encryption. So you could go back to either one of them, see how you can do the installation, make the installation and come back. Once you have done the installation, you will have the main cluster on your master server. Now let's create a cluster on the second machine, on the machine of the replica server. Remember, I'm using two machines, one machine for the master server, the other machine for the replica server. To create a cluster on a replica server, you just do this command after installation of the PostgreSQL database. So on the replica server, sudo pg create cluster 10 is the version of the Postgres, and you give it a name for the directory where you want to make the replica. Give it a username, and this is the main directory where you will create the cluster by this name, by the name of replica, which you can select whichever name you wish. and here this is the port of your replica server. You could select whichever number, and here this is the start. This will help you when you do any restart for the system. You won't have to go on the terminal and restart the replica server. It will be started automatically. Now, one point to notice: if you want to create the replica cluster on the same machine of the master cluster, you can do that. It is very easy. You can just do this code, sudo pg create cluster 10 replica, and that's it. You will have a replica cluster which is made and created in the master server. In this case, you will have both the replica cluster and the master cluster both in the one machine, which is the master server. But it is highly unrecommended that you do it this way. And the reason for that, supposing your master server crashed, in this case you will lose both your master databases and your replica databases. Both of them, they will be gone. That's why it's highly recommended that you do the replica on a different machine. So just in case if your master machine crashed, at least you would have the replica machine working, and you could use the hot standby, which we will know what is the hot standby later on. Now, if you are using the Ubuntu, you can go to this link, and you will know how you can create a cluster from this, and it will give you a good description about, and it gives you what are the options that you can use to create the cluster. Now, there is one thing, we will move now to point number 2, step number 2. To create folders to save the wall files. The archive files on both the master and the replica. The way to do that is pretty easy. On the master server, you'll sudo user make directory, you give it the directory a name, and you give the folder a name. And same thing on the replica server, you will do the same, you directory and give it any name you wish on your replica server. Now you can amend the -p extension, the -p switch. This will give you the details about the percentage of the process of the streaming. When you stream the data from the master to the replica, the -p will show you the percentage of the completion of the transfer of the streaming process. You can just amend it in here or in here, and you will see the percentage of the transfer of the streaming process. And once you have done this, once you created this cluster, when you created these directories and folders, you can just start over both the master and the replica with this code. Now here is the step number 4, which I talked to you about before in the previous slide, that you should do it at the beginning before you start with step number 1 and 2. This we will go on the master server. We will open the postgresql.conf file, which resides in this directory. Now, possibly in your installation, it will be resides in a different directory. You have to find it, and then once you have opened this file, the postgresql.conf file, which is the server configuration file, you can do these changes. First of all, check out the wall level. It should have a replica. Now by default on PostgreSQL 10 plus, it is this way by default, so there's no changes. But in previous version, in 9, you will see a hot standby, so you need to change it if you are using 10. Now this one by default, it is off. Now if you are using a fully encrypted database with PG Rewind, then it is recommended that you change it and make it as on, because by default it is off. Now the archive mode, you need, by default it is off, you need to change it and make it on. The archive command we will talk about later when we will use the PG receivable instead of the common command, which is not recommended to use it. So we will talk about this later on. Now the Maxwell senders, by default it is 5. The senders means the processes that will be allowed to handle your streaming of data and recovery of data. It's just like you could say as if it's CPUs, you know. So it's the processes that will handle the streaming of the data from the master to the replica and the recovery of the data from the replica to the master. By default I believe it's 5, so you can increase it to make it to 10, change it to 10. There is a wall keep segments, by default it's 0. Now if you are not using slots, a replica slot, if you are not using replica slot, in our case we will use a replica slot, but for now if you are not using a replica slot, then it is better to change it and make it 64. Now what is this the benefit? Now usually the master server consistently produce log files of all the transactions that are taking place in the database. So if you are not using a slot which is connected to the replica, if you are not using this slot, these log files which are generated by the master server will be saved in this segment. So you need to give it a good size, which is 64 megabyte. You need to change it to make it 64 megabyte, so you can keep and save all these log files that is consistently generated from the master server. That if you not use a replica slot. But if you use a replica slot, just keep it as it is. Just like this, keep it. If you don't use a replica slot, change it and make it 64. Now the hot standby, by default on version 10 is on. The hot standby, as we explained before, is that the replica, we can use it and read data from it using the select query. And also, if our master server crashed, we can use the replica server as a main server until we can fix the main server or the master server.